I can't breathe.
If you're anything like me, you love movies. But let's be honest, they just hit different when you find out they actually happened. Lately, I've been going down a rabbit hole of films based on real cases, and here are some of them that have genuinely messed me up. I'll be breaking down the movies first, just briefly, and then talk about the true stories behind them in depth, so of course there will be spoilers. And yeah, some of these are not for the faint-hearted, so viewer discretion is definitely advised. Craig Zobel's 2012 directorial debut that premiered at Sundance caused such an outrage that people shouted at the filmmakers during the Q&A session. The film follows Sandra, a fast food manager played by Ann Dowd, working a Friday evening shift at a restaurant called Chickwich. She gets a call from someone identifying himself as Officer Daniels. He sounds professional and authoritative, someone who knows the lingo. He tells her one of her employees, a blonde teenager named Becky, has stolen money from a customer's purse and needs to be detained immediately.
This is about a theft. It seems one of your employees stole some money from a customer's purse.
I'm sorry?
You have a young lady who works at the register, about 19 years old, blonde.
Becky?
Becky. Yeah, we have her name is Rebecca. That's right, Becky.
So Sandra brings Becky into the back office. The caller walks her through what he claims is standard procedure. The call stretches on. When Sandra needs to handle the restaurant floor, the caller tells her to have someone else supervise. She brings in other employees. And when her fiancé Van shows up to give her a ride home, the caller convinces him to take over. What follows is shot in long, uncomfortable takes with claustrophobic framing and almost no music. The film makes you squirm in your seat and think there's absolutely no way real people would actually do this. Except they did. Because compliance is based on an incident that happened at a McDonald's in Mount Washington, Kentucky. And somehow the real story is worse. It's Friday, April 9th, 2004, around 5 p.m. The McDonald's in Mount Washington, Kentucky is slammed with the dinner rush. Donna Jean Summers, the assistant manager on duty, is juggling orders when she gets a phone call. The man on the other end identifies himself as Officer Scott. Or maybe it was Officer Daniels. The name changed throughout the call, which should have been a red flag, but Donna's busy and stressed and this guy sounds legitimate. He's got that clipped law enforcement tone and uses the right terminology. He tells her they've received a report that one of her employees has been stealing from customers. The suspect is 18-year-old Louise Ogborn, working the counter right now. He needs Donna to detain Louise immediately for questioning while they finish up their investigation. He's very insistent this needs to happen right now, today, this minute, because the investigation is time-sensitive and they're coordinating with multiple agencies. Now here's where you'd expect any reasonable person to say, "Come down here yourself." But this caller has done his homework. He knows details about the restaurant and about corporate loss prevention procedures and how these investigations work. He sounds exactly like what Donna thinks a police officer conducting an investigation would sound like. So Donna calls Louise into the back office. The caller instructs Donna to search Louise's pockets and her purse. And when she does, she finds nothing.
Hello, officer? Hello?
What's the news?
I didn't find anything in her purse or in her pockets.
The caller says Louise must have hidden the stolen money in her clothing. He needs Donna to conduct a strip search. Donna, apparently believing this is an official police investigation she's legally obligated to assist with, complies. But that's just the beginning. Because this phone call doesn't last 20 minutes. It lasts 3.5 hours. The caller stays on the line, giving increasingly disturbing instructions. He tells Donna she needs to have someone else watch Louise, while Donna handles the restaurant. Donna calls in a shift manager, Michaela, who refuses to participate and walks out. Smart woman. Then Donna calls in her fiancé, Walter Nix Jr., who'd shown up to give her a ride home after her shift. The caller convinces Donna to have Nix take over supervision. With Nix now alone with Louise in that back office, the caller manipulates him into unspeakable acts. The kind of acts that when the full details came out during trial, people couldn't fathom how multiple human beings participated. Eventually, an off-duty employee comes in for his paycheck. Jason Bradley, a custodian, walks past the office and sees what's happening. He immediately tells Nix this is insane, none of this is legal, and he needs to hang up the phone right now. And thankfully, Nix finally does. Louise is left traumatized and calls 911. Police arrive and immediately recognize this for what it is: a hoax. There was no investigation or any stolen money, just a sick prank that spiraled into hours of abuse. And what makes this worse is that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was one call in a series of approximately 70 similar hoax calls made to fast food restaurants and grocery stores across 32 states over more than a decade. The pattern was always the same. A man would call claiming to be a police officer or corporate investigator, report that an employee had stolen something, and then use psychological manipulation to convince managers to strip search young female workers. Sometimes the instructions escalated far beyond searches. The calls happened everywhere: Wendy's, Burger King, Applebee's, Taco Bell. Different states, different victims, same playbook. And almost always, people complied. Louise reported what happened immediately. Investigators reviewed everything and were horrified. They launched a manhunt, and pretty quickly, a suspect emerged. David Richard Stewart, a 38-year-old corrections officer from Panama City, Florida, with access to law enforcement databases and a documented history of making prank calls. The evidence seemed solid. Phone records traced the call to the McDonald's back to a calling card Stewart had purchased at a Walmart near his home. Investigators found he'd been in areas where several other hoax calls had originated. He worked in corrections, which explained his familiarity with interrogation tactics and legal jargon that made his calls sound legitimate. In October 2006, Stewart went to trial in Bullitt County, Kentucky. Prosecutors presented phone records, testimony from victims across multiple states, and expert analysis showing patterns in the calls. They argued Stewart was the serial caller who'd been terrorizing fast food workers for over a decade. The jury deliberated, and then they acquitted him on all charges. Apparently, there was not enough evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Stewart made that specific call to that specific McDonald's on that specific day. Yes, the phone records showed the call originated from a calling card he'd purchased, but prosecutors couldn't definitively prove he was the one using it at that exact moment. Reasonable doubt. Stewart walked free. And here's the suspicious part. The hoax calls stopped completely after Stewart's arrest. Just stopped. For over a decade, someone had been making these calls across 32 states. Then Stewart gets arrested and suddenly nothing. Radio silence. But because they couldn't prove it beyond legal doubt, he was acquitted. Walter Nix Jr. wasn't so lucky. He pleaded guilty to abuse, misconduct, and unlawful imprisonment. In March 2006, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He claimed he genuinely believed he was following police orders, that he was confused and manipulated by the caller. The judge didn't care. Nix served his time. Donna Summers was fired from McDonald's. She wasn't charged with any crime, though what happened on her watch destroyed Louise's life. Summers later said she genuinely believed she was helping police with an investigation and had no idea things would escalate the way they did. She expressed remorse, but also maintained she was a victim of the caller's manipulation. And Louise Ogborn? She filed a civil lawsuit, not just against Nix and Summers, but against McDonald's Corporation itself. Her argument was devastating. McDonald's had been aware of this pattern of hoax calls for years. Other McDonald's locations had been targeted. McDonald's had sent out warnings to some franchises, but never implemented mandatory training or clear procedures for handling these situations. They knew this scam existed and failed to protect their workers. McDonald's fought back hard, arguing that Summers and Nix were entirely responsible for their own actions. The corporation couldn't be held liable for the criminal acts of a hoax caller and the poor judgment of their employees. But Louise's attorneys produced internal McDonald's documents, memos showing that McDonald's was well aware of similar incidents, evidence that warnings had been issued to some locations but not others, and proof that no comprehensive training existed to help managers recognize and respond to these calls. In October 2007, a jury awarded Louise $5 million in punitive damages against McDonald's for their negligence, and $1.1 million in compensatory damages, so $6.1 million in total. The jury found that McDonald's had indeed been negligent in failing to warn employees and implement procedures to prevent exactly this kind of incident. But McDonald's appealed. The case dragged through courts for 2 more years. But in 2009, the Kentucky Court of Appeals upheld the verdict. McDonald's had failed in their duty to protect workers from a known and foreseeable threat. Louise got her settlement, though no amount of money could undo 3.5 hours in that back office. The case remains technically unsolved. David Richard Stewart was never convicted. Whether he was actually guilty or whether the real caller saw the media attention and decided to retire, nobody knows. For everyone who watched the movie and thought, that's ridiculous, nobody would actually do that, the answer is simple. It happened at least 70 times across 32 states over more than a decade. Different restaurants, different managers, different victims, same playbook, same results, all because nobody thought to just hang up the phone. Borderland is a 2007 horror film directed by Zev Berman that follows three college friends who cross into Mexico for spring break and end up in the hands of a cult that practices human sacrifice. The leader, a charismatic drug dealer who believes ritual murder makes him invincible, runs the operation with his high priestess from a remote ranch. And like most horror films based on true events, the real story is somehow worse. It's March 14th, 1989. Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old pre-med student at the University of Texas, is doing what every college kid does during spring break, getting absolutely hammered in a Mexican border town. He and three friends drove to South Padre Island, Texas, then crossed into Matamoros, Mexico for cheaper drinks and zero drinking age enforcement. The kind of decision that seems brilliant at 2 a.m. and catastrophically stupid in hindsight. Around midnight, the four of them are bar hopping along Calle Alvaro Obregón, the main strip. Mark is walking slightly ahead of his buddies when he turns a corner. His friends follow seconds later, but he's gone. Just vanished into thin air in the middle of a crowded street. They search for hours, ask locals, check every bar, nothing. By morning, they report him missing to both Mexican and American authorities, and here's where things get bureaucratically nightmarish.
Our amigo is missing.
Mexican police suggest Mark probably just wandered off drunk or ran away. American officials can't do much because he disappeared on Mexican soil. The Kilroy family flies to Matamoros and plasters the city with missing person posters offering a reward. Weeks pass, no leads. Meanwhile, about 20 miles west at a ranch called Santa Elena, something much darker is happening. But to understand that, you need to know about Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo. He was born November 1st, 1962, in Miami to a Cuban mother who practiced Santeria, an Afro-Caribbean religion involving animal sacrifice and spirit worship. But Adolfo gravitated toward Palo Mayombe, a much darker offshoot involving rituals you don't want to know about. His mother took him to ceremonies as a child where he watched priests slaughter animals and claim they could speak to the dead. By his 20s, Constanzo had moved to Mexico City and set himself up as a fortune teller and witch doctor to wealthy clients, including drug traffickers. He was charming, handsome, and claimed he could make people invisible to police and bulletproof through magic. And because drug dealers are apparently the most superstitious people on earth, they believed him. In 1987, Constanzo met Sara Aldrete, a 24-year-old student at Texas Southmost College in Brownsville. She was smart, pretty, and had absolutely no idea what she was getting into. Constanzo nicknamed her La Madrina, the godmother, and convinced her she had supernatural powers. Together they built a cult around Palo Mayombe, recruiting members who believed Constanzo could make them invincible through ritual sacrifice. And by sacrifice, I mean human sacrifice. Constanzo moved the operation to Rancho Santa Elena, a remote property outside Matamoros, owned by a family of drug smugglers, the Hernandez clan. They were moving marijuana across the border and figured having a witch doctor on payroll couldn't hurt. Constanzo told them that humans would create a protective shield around their operation. The smugglers, who clearly never questioned this logic, agreed. So Constanzo started abducting people, drifters, strangers, anyone who he thought wouldn't be missed. He'd torture them to death in elaborate rituals, remove their brains and hearts, and boil the organs in an iron cauldron called a inganga, along with animal remains, human bones, and blood. This horrifying stew was supposed to grant supernatural protection. By early 1989, at least 13 people had been at the ranch. And then Constanzo decided he needed someone with more cerebral energy, someone smart, someone like a pre-med student perhaps. On March 14th, 1989, cult members were driving through Matamoros looking for a victim when they spotted Mark Kilroy walking slightly ahead of his friends. They grabbed him, shoved him into a vehicle, and drove him to the ranch. Mark was held captive for hours before being ritually. His brain was removed and added to the nganga, and his body was buried in a shallow grave with the others. For weeks, nobody connected his disappearance to the ranch. The Hernandez family kept smuggling drugs. Constanzo kept performing rituals. Everything was fine until April 1st, 1989, when one of the Hernandez nephews, Serafin, did something spectacularly stupid. He was driving a truck full of marijuana through a police checkpoint and just didn't stop. Because Constanzo had told him he was invisible to the police. Spoiler alert, he was not invisible. Officers chased him to Rancho Santa Elena, where they intended to arrest him for drug trafficking. But when police searched the ranch, they found something far worse than marijuana. A shed filled with occult artifacts, blood everywhere, And then the graves. Shallow pits containing the remains of at least 15 people, many of them missing body parts, showing signs of torture. In the shed sat the Nganga, still containing human remains. Mark Kilroy's body was among them. He'd been dead for nearly a month. The discovery made international headlines. American media descended on Matamoros. Kilroy's family finally had answers, though not the ones they wanted. Mexican authorities launched a manhunt for Constanzo and Aldrete, who'd fled to Mexico City. On May 6, 1989, police tracked them to an apartment in the city. When officers surrounded the building, Constanzo did what any rational cult leader would do when cornered. He ordered one of his followers, Alvaro de Leon Valdez, to shoot him and his male lover, Martin Quintana, because apparently going to prison was less appealing than getting shot in the head by your own cult member. Valdez complied. Constanzo died instantly at age 26, taking his insane beliefs about magical invincibility with him. The irony of a man who claimed to be bulletproof ordering someone to shoot him was apparently lost on everyone involved. Sara Aldrete was arrested at the scene. She claimed she had no idea about the murders, which is a tough sell when you're literally nicknamed the godmother of a murder cult. She and several other cult members were tried and convicted. She was sentenced to 62 years in prison for her role in the killings, where she remains to this day. The Hernandez family members who participated were also convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The ranch was demolished, though locals claim the area is still cursed. Mark Kilroy's family established a foundation in his name to help other families of missing persons. His mother spent years advocating for better cooperation between US and Mexican authorities in cross-border cases. And the Nganga, Mexican authorities destroyed it after the trial, though pieces were reportedly kept as evidence. Whether it ever granted anyone supernatural protection remains unclear, but considering everyone involved either died or went to prison, I'm going to say the magic didn't work. All because a drug dealer thought boiling human brains in a cauldron would make him invisible to police. It didn't. The Frozen Ground is a 2013 thriller directed by Scott Walker that stars Nicolas Cage as an Alaska State Trooper, John Cusack as a mild-mannered baker with a dark hobby, and Vanessa Hudgens as a young woman who escaped death by pure luck. The film follows Trooper Jack Holcomb as he investigates Robert Hansen, a respected Anchorage businessman suspected of abducting women from the city's red light district. Hansen, played by Cusack with creepy restraint, runs a successful bakery by day and pursues his passion for hunting women by night. When a woman named Cindy Paulson manages to escape from Hansen's clutches and reports what happened to police, Holcomb becomes obsessed with taking him down. The problem is that Hansen looks like everyone's friendly neighbor. He's married with kids, volunteers at church, and nobody believes a respected business owner would do something so horrific. The true story is somehow even more disturbing than what made it to screen. It's the early 1980s in Anchorage, Alaska. The city is booming thanks to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline bringing in thousands of workers, most of them men with money to burn, and no families around to keep them in check. The red light district along 4th Avenue is thriving. Dancers, workers, and women down on their luck populate the area, and nobody really pays much attention when one of them goes missing. These are people society has already decided don't matter, which makes them perfect targets. And someone is absolutely taking advantage of that. Between 1971 and 1983, women start disappearing from Anchorage's streets, not all at once, not in any pattern that immediately screams serial killer. Just occasional vanishings that get chalked up to the transient nature of the population. Maybe she moved to another city, maybe she got clean and started over somewhere else, maybe she just didn't want to be found. Nobody's connecting the dots, and absolutely nobody suspects that the man responsible is someone they see every day at the bakery. Robert Hansen was born February 15th, 1939 in Esterville, Iowa, to a Danish immigrant father who ran a bakery. He had a rough childhood. Relentlessly bullied at school, he found solace in exactly two things: working at his father's bakery and hunting in the wilderness. The hunting part is important, because Robert got really good at it. By his teens, he was winning local archery competitions and developing skills that would later serve a very different purpose. But socially, he was a complete disaster. Girls wanted nothing to do with him. He was awkward, had a severe stutter, and couldn't get through a sentence without stumbling over his words. The rejection stung, and it festered. After a stint in the Army Reserve and a failed first marriage, Hansen moved to Anchorage in 1967 with his second wife Darla and their 2 kids. He opened a bakery near downtown Anchorage. Hansen's bakery became a local fixture. Good bread, friendly service, family man running a respectable business. Everyone loved Bob Hansen. Except Bob Hansen had a hobby that nobody knew about. He'd take his Piper Super Cub, the small plane perfect for Alaska's rugged terrain, and fly out to remote locations to hunt. Big game, mostly. Dall sheep, bear, caribou. He was so good at it that he won several hunting competitions and had an impressive collection of trophies mounted in his home. The kind of guy who could track, shoot, and kill with terrifying precision. And at some point, hunting animals stopped being enough. By the late 1970s, Hansen had developed a system. He'd cruise the 4th Avenue area in Anchorage, looking for dancers or workers, women he thought nobody would miss. He'd offer them money, get them into his car, drive them to his home while his wife was conveniently away, chain them up in his basement, and assault them for hours. Then came the truly sick part. He'd load them into his plane, fly them out to the Nick River wilderness, let them go, and hunt them, like animals. He'd give them a head start sometimes, let them run through the frozen tundra in whatever clothes they had on, which usually wasn't much. Then he'd track them down with his hunting rifle or his bow and arrow, the same skills he'd honed winning competitions, and kill them. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves scattered across the wilderness, places so remote that nobody would ever accidentally stumble across them. And he got away with it for over a decade. It's June 13th, 1983. Robert Hansen picks up 17-year-old Cindy Paulson from 4th Avenue. He offers her $200. She gets in his car, he drives her to his house, chains her to a post in his basement, and assaults her for hours. Then he tells her he's going to fly her out to his cabin, which is serial killer code for "you're about to become a hunting trophy." Except Hansen makes a mistake. When they get to his car to drive to the airport, he forgets to handcuff Cindy before getting in. He just leaves her hands free for a split second. And that split second is all she needs. The moment he's distracted, Cindy bolts. She runs straight down the street with a chain still attached to her, and flags down a truck driver who calls the police. She gives them everything. Hansen's name, his address, a detailed description of his house and basement, what he did to her, what he said he was going to do to her. She's bleeding, terrified, and absolutely certain she was minutes away from being murdered in the Alaskan wilderness. The Alaska State Troopers investigate. They go to Hansen's house and meet a polite, well-spoken baker who seems genuinely confused about why police are at his door. He admits he'd solicited Cindy for certain services, sure, but claims she tried to rob him and he kicked her out. The handcuffs and chains? He likes to get freaky in bed a certain way, he explains calmly, and she agreed to it. When she tried to steal from him, he got angry. That's all that happened. Investigators are skeptical, but they've got a problem. Cindy has a record. Theft, drugs, the kind of background that defense attorneys love to shred on the stand. Hansen, meanwhile, is a respected businessman with no violent criminal history visible to them. Who's a jury going to believe? But State Trooper Sergeant Glenn Floth isn't convinced. He starts digging into Hansen's background and finds some interesting things. Hansen had been arrested multiple times before moving to Alaska. Theft in Iowa. Arson. In 1976, he'd even been arrested in Anchorage for trying to steal a chainsaw and got 5 years probation. And there were old rape accusations from years earlier that had never gone anywhere. Floth looks at the pattern of missing women from 4th Avenue, dancers and workers who vanished without a trace. He looks at Hansen's hunting trophies, his plane, his cabin in the wilderness, and realizes they might have been chasing a serial killer for over a decade without knowing it. So the FBI gets involved. They bring in criminal profiler John Douglas, the guy who basically invented modern profiling, and he looks at everything they have. The missing women, Cindy's testimony, Hansen's background and hunting expertise. Douglas tells them they're dealing with someone who's been doing this for years and is extremely organized about it. Investigators get a search warrant. When they search Hansen's house in October 1983, they find exactly what they're looking for. An aviation map marked with X's, 24 X's scattered across the wilderness around Anchorage, and jewelry, lots of jewelry, pieces that clearly belong to different women. They start excavating the X marks, and they find bodies buried in shallow graves in the remote Alaskan wilderness, exactly where Hansen's map said they'd be. Women who'd been missing for years, their remains scattered across Hansen's personal hunting ground. Confronted with the evidence, Hansen breaks. Not immediately, not dramatically, but eventually. He confesses to killing 17 women between 1971 and 1983. 17 women he abducted, assaulted, flew into the wilderness, and hunted for sport. He draws them more maps and shows them more burial sites, while describing his methods with the kind of casual detail that makes investigators sick. On February 27, 1984, Hansen pleads guilty to 4 counts of murder, 1 count of assault, 1 count of kidnapping, and multiple weapons charges as part of a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. The state agrees because Hansen's confessions are leading them to bodies they never would have found otherwise. The judge sentences Hansen to 461 years in prison, plus life without parole. Robert Hansen spent the next 30 years in Alaska's Spring Creek Correctional Center. No interviews, no media circus, just decades in a cell. On August 21, 2014, he died of natural causes at age 75. Darla, his wife, had stood by him through multiple arrests over the years, but finally divorced him after the full extent of his crimes came to light. Cindy Paulson, the woman whose escape ended Hansen's killing spree, disappeared from public life entirely after testifying against him. To this day, several of Hansen's victims remain unidentified. DNA testing has identified some over the years, but others are still listed as Jane Does, anonymous victims of a man who treated human beings like trophies to be mounted on a wall. Hollywood loves a good survival story. Give them some water, some life-threatening danger, and a ticking clock, and they'll turn it into a box office hit. Which is exactly what they did with Last Breath, the 2025 survival thriller starring Woody Harrelson, Simu Liu, and Finn Cole. The movie follows Chris Lemons, a saturation diver working 300 feet below the North Sea surface, maintaining undersea gas lines. It's the kind of job where you live in a pressurized chamber for weeks at a time, get lowered to the ocean floor in what's essentially a metal coffin called a diving bell, and spend your days doing manual labor in complete darkness while connected to the surface by a tube called an umbilical that supplies everything you need to not die. In the film, things go sideways when the ship's positioning system malfunctions during heavy seas, causing the vessel to drift away from the work site. Lemons gets separated from his team, his umbilical snaps, and he's left stranded on the seafloor with only minutes of emergency oxygen. His colleagues scramble to reboot the system, reposition the ship, and mount a desperate rescue attempt. They eventually find him after his oxygen's been gone for over 29 minutes, pull him back to the bell, and miraculously, he lives. It's tense and well made. The survival sequences are genuinely nerve-wracking, but the movie doesn't come close to capturing the absolute nightmare of what actually happened to the real Chris Lemons on September 18, 2012. Because the real story, it's so much worse. Let's start with what saturation diving actually is, because most people have no idea this job even exists. Imagine living inside a pressurized metal tube for 28 days straight. You can't leave. You're breathing a mixture of oxygen and helium that makes you sound like a cartoon character. The pressure inside that chamber has to match the pressure at the depth you'll be working, which in Chris Lemons' case was about 90 meters, or roughly 300 feet below sea level. Your body becomes saturated with gas at that pressure, and if you decompress too quickly, your blood literally boils and you die in agony. So you stay locked in that chamber until your rotation is over, and they can slowly decompress you back to normal atmospheric pressure over the course of days. Every day during your rotation, you climb into an even smaller pressurized chamber called a diving bell. That bell gets lowered through the freezing North Sea to the seafloor, where you exit in your diving suit and go to work. You're connected to the bell by an umbilical cable that provides literally everything you need to survive. Communications, hot water pumped into your suit to keep you from freezing in 3 degrees Celsius water, light because it's pitch black down there, and most importantly, your breathing gas. Without that umbilical, you've got nothing. Well, almost nothing. You carry emergency tanks with about 8 to 9 minutes of air. That's it. That's your entire backup plan if something goes catastrophically wrong. And on September 18th, 2012, something did go catastrophically wrong. Chris Lemons, 32 years old at the time, was having what he'd later describe as a very normal day at the office. He was aboard the Bibi Topaz, a dive support vessel positioned about 100 kilometers northeast of Aberdeen at the Huntington oil field. The weather was rough, 35 knots of wind, 18-foot swells, but nothing unusual for the North Sea in September. Lemons and his colleagues, Duncan Alcock and Dave Uasa, took their diving bell down to 90 meters. Alcock stayed in the bell to monitor everything. Lemons and Uasa dropped out onto the seafloor to repair a pipe on a manifold, basically a massive drilling structure about the size of a house. They'd been working for about an hour when alarms started going off on the ship. Then came a message from the surface, and the urgency in the dive supervisor's voice made it clear this wasn't a drill. Leave everything there. Get out of the structure, boys. Lemons and Uasa dropped their tools and scrambled off the manifold. That's when the confusion set in, because when they looked up expecting to see the diving bell about 10 meters above them, it wasn't there. The Topaz's dynamic positioning system had failed, in heavy seas. The ship was drifting away from the worksite, fast, and the diving bell, still attached to the ship, was being dragged along with it. Now you might think, okay, just swim to the surface. Except that's not an option. Going up to the surface when you're saturated at 90 meters of pressure means explosive decompression. Your blood boils, your organs rupture, you die within seconds. There's only one safe place at that depth, and it's the diving bell. So Lemons and Yuasa did the only thing they could. They started climbing their umbilical cables, hand over hand, chasing after the bell that was being pulled away from them. Yuasa was climbing next to him. They were making progress. And then, suddenly, Lemons couldn't climb anymore. A loop of his umbilical had snagged on part of the manifold structure. He immediately knew he was caught, and he immediately knew what was about to happen. Because on the other end of that cable was an 8,000-ton vessel being pushed by gale force winds, pulling the umbilical tighter and tighter. There was nothing he could do to release it. Yuasa noticed Lemons was in trouble and turned back to help. Lemons remembers their eyes meeting. He was silently begging Yuasa to do something, anything. But Yuasa was still attached to his own umbilical, and the ship was pulling on that too. Within seconds, Yuasa was being dragged away. Lemons watched his friend disappear into the darkness. Then the ship pulled harder, and the umbilical snapped. Not all at once. First, the communications cable. Lemons describes it like a jack being pulled from a speaker. Suddenly he had no way to talk to anyone, just silence. Then the hose providing his breathing gas ruptured. Suddenly, 90 meters below the surface in near freezing water, Chris Lemons had nothing to breathe.
Gas supply! I can't breathe!
Saturation divers are trained for this exact scenario. When your main gas supply fails, you reach up, turn a knob on the side of your helmet, and open your emergency tanks. Lemons did exactly that. The gas flooded his helmet and he could breathe again. For now. But opening that emergency supply changes everything. You've just moved from infinite gas being pumped from the surface to 8, maybe 9 minutes. That's all the time you have to get rescued. Except when the umbilical snapped, Lemons had fallen back onto the seabed. His light was gone. His hot water was gone. And he was now sitting in what he describes as the most infinite darkness. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. Just absolute suffocating blackness. He knew the manifold was close. That's where rescue would happen, if rescue happened at all. But he had no idea which direction it was. No compass, no light, no way to orient himself. Again, I was very lucky. I bumped straight into it. He climbed up the manifold, terrified of letting go and losing it in the dark. When he got to the top, he looked up, expecting to see Dave on his way back or the diving bell coming to get him. Instead, he sees nothing, just more darkness. By this point, Lemons estimates he'd used about 4 or 5 minutes of his emergency gas, maybe less. He was breathing hard. Even if rescue was already on the way, there wasn't enough time. The math didn't work. I realized this was probably going to be it. And in a strange way, that realization calmed him down. The fear drained out. The panic stopped. There was nothing he could do. He curled into a fetal position on top of the manifold. I was overtaken by grief. A great sadness took over at that point. He thought about his life. He was 32, getting married next year, building a house. He had plans. He had dreams, travel, kids, a future. And all of it was about to be ripped away in this dark, cold, lonely place. He remembers thinking, how is this dark, lonely place where I end my days? Then his emergency air ran out, and Chris Lemons lost consciousness. Meanwhile, on the Topaz, everyone was scrambling. The dynamic positioning system was dead. The ship was drifting in gale force winds. They couldn't drop anchor because they were surrounded by gas pipelines. The captain and first mate took manual control of the ship's thrusters, fighting to keep the vessel from drifting further while a crew member desperately tried to get the positioning back online. Yuasa made it back to the bell, exhausted. He and Alcock were safe, but Lemons was still out there. They launched a remotely operated vehicle, basically a mini submarine with cameras, and somehow they found him, just lying there on top of the manifold in his fetal position, and his arm was moving, twitching. Some of the crew thought he was waving at the camera, signaling he was still alive. Lemons would later dismiss this. I'm definitely unconscious at that point. The twitching was probably just his body shutting down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they got the positioning system back online. The ship repositioned over the work site. Yuasa left the bell again. He was going to retrieve Lemons' body. That's what everyone thought this was, a body recovery. Because it had been 35 minutes since Lemons' umbilical snapped. 35 minutes since he'd switched to emergency air that was only supposed to last 8 or 9 minutes. Nobody survives that. It's not possible. Yuasa dragged Lemons back to the bell. Alcock pulled off his helmet. Lemons was bright blue, not breathing. Alcock gave him mouth-to-mouth, 2 big puffs of air, and Chris Lemons gasped and came back to life. He doesn't remember being rescued.
What's happened?
His first memory after blacking out is being in the bell with Yuasa and Alcock grabbing onto him, and him grabbing back. When they finally got him to a hospital, doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him. No brain damage, no organ damage, no lasting effects from spending more than 25 minutes without oxygen at 90 meters below sea level. Nobody could explain it, and still can't. The best theories involve the extreme cold putting his body into metabolic slowdown and the high concentration of oxygen saturating his tissues. But nobody knows for sure. 3 weeks later, Chris Lemons was back at work, back in a diving bell, in the exact same spot where he'd nearly died. He got married a few months after that, built the house, had the kids. All those hopes and dreams he thought were being ripped away in the darkness. He got them. The miracle isn't just that he survived, it's that he survived without any idea how or why, and then went right back to doing the same job that nearly killed him. Woman of the Hour, Anna Kendrick's 2024 directorial debut, takes one of the most disturbing footnotes in television history and turns it into a thriller. The film follows Rodney Alcala, a photographer played by Daniel Zavato, and Cheryl Bradshaw, an aspiring actress played by Kendrick herself. The movie jumps around in time, showing us Alcala's encounters with various women between 1971 and 1979, all building toward the moment that would make him infamous. In 1978, Alcala appeared as a contestant on The Dating Game.
Between takes, he might find him skydiving or motorcycling. Please welcome Rodney Alcala. Rod, welcome.
One of those cheesy 70s dating shows where a woman asks questions to 3 bachelors she can't see and picks one for a romantic getaway. In the film, Cheryl is a struggling actress who thinks the whole show is shallow garbage, but her agent convinces her it might be her big break. She ends up on stage asking cringeworthy scripted questions to 3 hidden bachelors. Bachelor number 3 is Rodney Alcala, described by the host as a successful photographer who enjoys skydiving and motorcycling. Cheryl decides to go off script, asking her own questions instead of the sexist nonsense the producers wrote for her. Rodney gives answers that seem thoughtful and respectful, which impresses her enough to choose him as the winner. Their prize is a weekend trip to Carmel by the Sea. After the taping, they go for drinks. He tries to charm her, but when she playfully teases him, his whole demeanor shifts. The mask slips just enough for her to feel deeply uncomfortable. She barely makes it to her car before he can do anything. The film is well made and treats the victims with dignity, but it doesn't come close to capturing how much worse the real story is. Because Rodney Alcala wasn't just a serial killer who happened to appear on a dating show. He was something far more terrifying. And the full scope of what he did, how many times he was caught and released, how many warnings were ignored, is more enraging than any movie could convey. Rodney James Alcala was born in San Antonio, Texas in 1943. Smart kid, academically gifted. At 17, he joined the army, where fellow soldiers noted he was manipulative, vindictive, and inappropriate with young women. In 1964, a military psychiatrist diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and estimated his IQ at 135, dangerously smart. The army discharged him on medical grounds. After graduating from UCLA, Alcala became obsessed with photography. He used his camera as a weapon, approaching women and girls, telling them he was a professional photographer, offering to take their pictures for his portfolio. For some, the photo session went fine. For others, it went very differently. September 25th, 1968. A passing motorist sees Alcala luring an 8-year-old girl named Tali Shapiro into his apartment. He calls police. Officer Chris Camacho kicks in the door and finds Tali lying in a pool of blood, beaten with a steel bar. She wasn't breathing. Camacho thought she was dead. Then she started gagging. She was alive, barely. Tali spent 32 days in a coma and months in recovery. Alcala had slipped out the back during the break-in. The FBI put him on their 10 most wanted list. Massive manhunt, guy gets caught, spends the rest of his life in prison. Except that's not what happened. Alcala fled to New York and enrolled at NYU under the name John Berger. He made friends, went to classes, His fellow film students thought he was great. One professor later told police Alcala was a wonderful guy who would never hurt anyone, and while in New York, Alcala killed again. In June 1971, a 23-year-old flight attendant named Cornelia Crilly was moving into a new apartment. Alcala offered to help her move furniture. She accepted. Once they got everything upstairs, she offered him a beer. They talked about films. She let her guard down, and he strangled her to death with her own nylon stockings. The case went cold. Police had nothing to go on. Alcala moved to New Hampshire and got a job as a counselor at an arts camp for girls. He spent his days supervising young campers, and nobody had any idea they'd hired a man wanted by the FBI for nearly killing an 8-year-old. Until 2 campers saw his face on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted poster at the post office. They reported it. Alcala was arrested and extradited to California. This is where the justice system failed. Tali's family had moved to Mexico and refused to let her testify. Without their witness, prosecutors offered Alcala a deal. Plead guilty to child molestation, get 1 year to life. He took the deal. The parole board let him out after 34 months. Less than 3 years for nearly beating an 8-year-old to death. Less than 2 months after release, he was arrested again for assaulting a 13-year-old girl, convicted, sent back to prison, then somehow paroled again in 1977. His parole officer gave him permission to travel to New York. A known predator with 2 convictions for crimes against children, allowed to travel across the country. In July 1977, Alcala met 23-year-old Ellen Jane Hover. Her datebook showed an appointment with John Berger, Alcala's alias. She was never seen alive again. Her remains were found almost a year later. Back in California, Alcala got a job at the Los Angeles Times and worked weddings as a photographer. His co-workers recalled he showed them photographs of young women and girls, many in compromising positions. When asked why he took such pictures, he'd say the girls' mothers had asked him to. Then in 1978, someone at the dating game put this charming photographer on their show. No background check. They just saw a handsome guy and thought he'd make good television. So Rodney Alcala, registered sex offender currently on a murder spree, became bachelor number 3. The woman who chose him, Cheryl Bradshaw, later said she found him deeply unsettling. She described weird vibes coming off him, called him very strange, and refused to go on the date. Jed Mills, one of the other bachelors, would later describe Alcala as obnoxious and creepy, giving off such disturbing energy that Mills couldn't stand to be near him. Cheryl Bradshaw's instincts probably saved her life. Between November 1977 and June 1979, Alcala went on a rampage. He killed 18-year-old Jill Barkham, 27-year-old nurse Georgia Wickstead, and 32-year-old Charlotte Lamb. In February 1979, he picked up 15-year-old Monique Hoyt. She survived his attack by convincing him she enjoyed it, then escaped at a gas station. Police arrested Alcala, but his mother posted bail. While out on bail, he killed again. Jill Parenteau, a 21-year-old, was found dead in her apartment. On June 20th, 1979, 12-year-old Robin Samso was riding her bike to ballet class when she disappeared. She'd been at the beach earlier when a photographer approached her and a friend. The friend would later describe how he honed in on them like a shark in the water. When Robin's remains were found, she'd been there so long she was just bones. Her mother wanted to see her daughter's body. The officer had to tell her there was no hair. The 12-year-old with long blonde hair had been dead so long, there was nothing left that resembled the person she'd been. Alcala's parole officer saw the composite sketch and called detectives. Police arrested him. In his storage locker, they found hundreds of photographs, many explicit images of minors, and a silk bag filled with earrings, including a pair Robin's mother immediately recognized. Alcala was convicted and sentenced to death in 1980, but the California Supreme Court overturned it. He was convicted again in 1986, overturned again in 2001. A third trial was ordered. For Robin's family, it was unbearable. Decades of retrials.
We've gone through a lot of hell because of that animal. A lot of hell. A lot of hell.
At his third trial in 2010, Alcala represented himself. For 5 hours, he questioned himself on the stand, addressing himself as Mr. Alcala in a deeper voice, then answering his own questions. As part of his closing argument, he played a song that includes lyrics about wanting to kill people, for the jury deciding whether he should get the death penalty. Then came the surprise witness, Tali Shapiro, the 8-year-old girl who nearly died on his floor 42 years earlier, now an adult. She stood up and told the jury she was one of his first and one of his only living victims. She asked why there were so many other victims when it was a known fact what he'd done to her. Why hadn't it stopped with her? The jury sentenced him to death for the third time. In 2010, police released 120 of Alcala's photographs, asking for help identifying the subjects. They couldn't release almost 900 more because they were too explicit. One photo led to answers. A woman recognized her sister Christine, missing since 1977. Christine's remains were found in Wyoming. She'd been 6 months pregnant when she died. In 2016, Alcala was charged with her murder. Prosecutors flew to California to interview him at Corcoran Prison. They found a frail, elderly man, but still sharp enough to play games. When they showed him the photo of Christine on a motorcycle, something changed. His eyes focused. He took the photograph, set it on his lap, and started tracing her body with his finger. For 5 minutes, he just traced the outline. Then the tracing turned to tapping, harder and harder, right over Christine's image. When they asked directly if he killed her, he denied it, said they were crazy. When asked if she was alive when he left her, he said yes. She was alive when he left. Most subjects in Alcala's photographs remain unidentified. Police believe some could be additional victims. While he was conclusively linked to 8 murders, the true number could be over 130. Rodney Alcala died on July 24, 2021, in a hospital in Kings County, California. He was 77 years old. He died of a heart attack, peacefully, in a hospital bed, not choking for air, not terrified, not in pain. Nothing like the way his victims died. Tali Shapiro is still alive today. Robin Samso's mother spent decades fighting to keep Alcala behind bars, reliving her daughter's murder through multiple trials. Ellen Hover's family waited 40 years for answers. Christine Thornton's sister spent 39 years searching. And somewhere out there, in those hundreds of photos police released, there are probably more victims whose families still don't know what happened to them. The real horror isn't just what Alcala did, it's how many times he was allowed to do it. Veronica is a 2017 Spanish horror film directed by Paco Plaza that premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival and later dropped on Netflix, where it promptly terrified viewers so thoroughly that people claimed they couldn't finish watching it. The film follows a teenage girl named Veronica who decides to use a Ouija board during a solar eclipse while babysitting her younger siblings. Things go predictably wrong, and she spends the rest of the runtime dealing with the consequences of inviting whatever was on the other end of that conversation into her life. Critics praised the atmosphere and Sandra Escasena's performance as Veronica, though some felt the scares were overhyped by Netflix's marketing machine. But the film's real hook wasn't the jump scares or creepy cinematography. It was the based on a true story angle, specifically a case from Madrid in 1991 that became Spain's first officially documented paranormal incident in police records. And somehow the real story is even stranger than the movie. It's March 1990 in Madrid. Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro is an 18-year-old student who, like many teenagers in the 90s before smartphones existed, finds creative ways to entertain herself at school. On this particular day, that creativity involves sneaking into the school bathroom with some friends to play with a Ouija board. Because naturally, if you're going to contact the dead, the best place to do it is in a bathroom. The session is going about as well as you'd expect when a teacher bursts in, catches them mid-seance, and does what any responsible adult would do. She smashes the Ouija board. Except according to the girls present, something weird happens when the glass breaks. Smoke rises from the board, and Estefania, standing directly over it, inhales whatever just came out. Now, the smoke could have been anything. Condensation from the glass hitting cold tile, someone's imagination running wild, mass hysteria from getting busted by a teacher. But Estefania's friends swear they saw it, and more importantly, Estefania herself believed she inhaled something she shouldn't have. And that's when everything goes sideways. Over the next 16 months, Estefania starts experiencing seizures and hallucinations. She describes shadowy figures following her everywhere, not just at home, but on the bus, in the street, constantly lurking at the edges of her vision. She has violent episodes where she barks like an animal and attacks people without provocation. Her family takes her to doctors who prescribe Tegretol, an anti-seizure medication, but nothing helps. The episodes only get worse. On July 13th, 1991, Estefania has her most violent attack yet. She goes after her younger sister so brutally that the girl has a seizure from the trauma. The next day, July 14th, Estefania suffers a catastrophic episode. She's rushed to Gregorio Marañón Hospital in Madrid, where she dies that same night. The official cause of death is listed as pulmonary asphyxia, which is just the fancy way to say buildup of carbon dioxide due to a problem with breathing. The autopsy finds traces of the anti-seizure medication in her system, but no clear explanation for why an otherwise healthy 18-year-old just stopped breathing. Her family is devastated. But if they thought grief was the worst thing they'd have to deal with, they were spectacularly wrong. Shortly after Estefania's death, strange things start happening at the family home in Vallecas. Doors slamming on their own, objects moving without explanation, shadowy figures appearing in rooms. The family tries to rationalize it at first. Old house, grief playing tricks, stress manifesting physically. But the phenomena escalate to the point where they can't ignore it anymore. On November 27, 1992, Estefania's father, Maximo, finally calls the police at 2 a.m., reporting paranormal activity in his home, which is not a call most police departments are equipped to handle, but Inspector Jose Pedro Negri and his officers show up anyway, probably expecting to deal with a grieving family experiencing stress-induced delusions. Instead, they walk into what would become the first police report in Spanish history to officially document paranormal phenomena. According to the officers' statements, they witnessed a crucifix detach itself from the wall and fall to the floor. They saw shadowy humanoid figures moving through the house. Furniture shifted position on its own, and whatever was happening, it was disturbing enough that multiple officers filed reports confirming they'd witnessed events they couldn't rationally explain. The police report exists, it's documented. Officers went on record saying they saw things that shouldn't be possible, which is either the most elaborate case of mass hysteria in Spanish law enforcement history, or something genuinely unexplainable happened in that house. The Gutierrez family eventually moved out, unable to cope with whatever was tormenting them. The case became infamous in Spain, debated in paranormal circles and dismissed by skeptics who pointed to the lack of physical evidence and the family's grief-induced vulnerability to suggestion. So what actually happened? Theories range widely depending on who you ask. Skeptics argue Estefania had an undiagnosed neurological condition, possibly epilepsy or a brain tumor, that caused her seizures and hallucinations. The smoke from the Ouija board was likely nothing, but the trauma of being caught combined with teenage superstition convinced her she'd inhaled something malevolent. Her symptoms worsened due to the nocebo effect, her belief that she was cursed literally making her sicker until her condition killed her. The paranormal activity afterward was grief, stress, and confirmation bias. The family seeing patterns in random events because they desperately needed an explanation for why their daughter died. Others believe something genuinely supernatural occurred, that the Ouija board opened a door Estefania couldn't close, and whatever came through that door followed her until it killed her, then stayed behind to torment her family. The film Veronica takes significant liberties with the story, condensing the timeline, aging down the protagonist, adding a solar eclipse for dramatic effect, but the core elements remain. A teenage girl plays with forces she doesn't understand, suffers horrifying consequences, and dies under mysterious circumstances, while her family is left to deal with whatever she left behind, all because someone thought it would be fun to play with a Ouija board in a school bathroom. Turns out it wasn't.